So we're going to start going over the first two major endocrine glands. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on these two because it turns out the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland both secrete a large number of hormones, and these impact many other different cells in the body. So let's start out first by talking about the hypothalamus. And you'll remember we learned previously about the hypothalamus when we were looking at the central nervous system. And it's this region right here in the middle of the brain. It's immediately inferior to the thalamus. And we learned previously when we learned about the central nervous system that the main job of the hypothalamus is to maintain homeostasis. So it's involved in monitoring things like body temperature and a number of different things from water balance to sex drive. All of these different homeostatic set points are orchestrated in one way or another by the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus principally regulates these different types of homeostatic set points via the manufacture and release of certain types of hormones. And a big key feature that will let you know right away if a hormone you're looking at is one that's being manufactured by the hypothalamus is if you see the word releasing or the word inhibiting in the name of the hormone. So I'll give you some examples, and we'll look at a few of these in a couple slides. You'll be able to see them again. But things like thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone. Those are all examples, and notice that the word releasing or the word inhibiting occurs in the name. If you see that in the name, you know 100% it is a hypothalamus hormone. Now, when the hypothalamus releases these hormones, the interesting thing is that they don't just circulate throughout the body and have an impact on some distant organ. More frequently than not, they directly circulate it through a tiny little bed of capillaries to another organ that's immediately inferior to the hypothalamus called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. And you should be comfortable knowing both of those names. The pituitary gland receives information in the form of releasing or inhibiting hormone signals from the hypothalamus, and in response, it then releases or doesn't release other hormones. And we'll be talking more specifically about that in a minute. I have a couple of charts I can show you that give you a little bit better feel for the types of hormones that are released. But for the moment, I want to talk about the discrete sections or parts of the pituitary gland. There are two, and talk a little bit about their developmental history in terms of where they come from in the embryo. Now, we could divide the pituitary gland into two portions, and this previous picture I had on the previous slide here shows the pituitary gland right down here. The hypothalamus is this region up here. The darker or reddish colored region here is what's called the anterior pituitary. The other portion back here that's in a lighter color is the posterior pituitary. Now remember, if we could flip this picture around, and anterior would be on the right side of the picture and posterior on the left, depending on whether I'm looking at the person from the left side of the brain or the right side. So if I were to look at these two distinctly different regions of the pituitary gland, I discovered that developmentally, if we look in the embryo, they are derived from two very different types of tissue. So let's start with the anterior pituitary, which is also called the adenohypophysis. Adeno refers to the presence of glandular tissue, and the adenohypophysis is actually derived from epithelial tissue, and we all know that epithelial tissue can make glandular tissue, like sweat glands, for example. And the adenohypophysis, if we look at where it comes from developmentally, is very interesting that even though the adenohypophysis is found right in the middle, deep in the brain, it actually comes originally from tissue in the pharynx, which is another name for the throat. So if we look at the development here, we're looking at the embryo in cross-section. This region right in here is the region of the embryo that will eventually develop into the throat region or the pharynx. And if we look at it up close, you can see that there's a little pouching of the throat that pinches away from the pharynx and begins to migrate up towards the brain. And it fuses with another portion of tissue that's already located in the brain that is actually what will eventually become the posterior pituitary. Now, the portion of the pituitary gland that comes from the pharynx down here, this is the anterior pituitary. And because it's derived from the throat is lined with epithelial tissue, therefore the adenohypophysis is composed of epithelial tissue. So even though it's located within the brain, it's deep in the brain, in the middle of all this other neuronal tissue, it itself is epithelial tissue. And like other epithelial tissues, glandular tissues, it has the ability to manufacture and secrete chemicals, in other words, hormones. So this particular part of the pituitary gland is considered a true endocrine gland because it has the ability to manufacture hormones and then release those into the blood. Now compare that with the neurohypophysis, which is another name for the posterior pituitary. The neurohypophysis, as the name implies, is derived from nervous tissue. And if we go back here to our original picture, and let me get all this other stuff out of the way here, you can see that what will one day become the posterior pituitary does indeed derive from tissue within the brain. So no surprise here, this tissue is composed of axons, it's all part of the nervous system of the brain, and so it's considered neuronal tissue, and as such, it behaves differently in terms of production of chemicals and their release. And we're going to learn more about that in just a minute. Now, if we were to look at the slides here, the histological views of these types of tissue, you can see they look very different. Here's the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary. Down below here is the neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary. And you can see that the adenohypophysis looks very much like other types of glandular tissue that are derived from epithelium, whereas the neurohypophysis clearly has a different look to it. And if this slide were larger, we would actually be able to see the soma of neurons in here and axonal projections, etc. Now, I told you before that the hypothalamus and the hypophysis interact with each other, and that the hypothalamus manufactures hormones with the name releasing or inhibiting in them, and that these hormones are then passed along via the blood to, in this case, the anterior pituitary, and then from there, the anterior pituitary responds by releasing other hormones that influence parts of the body. This is what we call the hypothalamus hypophyseal axis, meaning that we have an interaction or a relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So an axis, by definition, simply means an interaction or a relationship, a functional relationship between two or more glands, in this case, that are discontinuous, meaning that they are not physically connected to each other, and so we have to utilize hormones and the bloodstream in order for them to communicate one with the other. There are lots of different axes in the body, and these axes include relationships between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and places like breast tissue, the mammary glands, the thyroid gland, the gonads, such as ovary and testes, the adrenal gland, and even the liver, which indirectly influences all kinds of different tissues throughout the body, and this has to do with growth. Now, we're going to be looking at each of these different axes in much more detail during class time. But for now, I just want you to be comfortable with the idea that we can have an interaction occurring between the hypothalamus, the hypophysis, and some target gland. So, for example, let's just do one. If we were to discuss the thyroid, for example, if we wanted to identify or to name the axis that involves the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the thyroid, we would call it the hypophyseal or hypophyseal, depending on how you pronounce it, thyroidal axis. And that indicates that we're talking about the interrelationships and the use of hormones for communication between those three organs. Now, I want to focus in for a second on the anterior pituitary and look more specifically at how exactly it is that the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary. And remember again, the anterior pituitary is made up of epithelial tissue. So even though it's in the brain, it has a completely different type of tissue from which it's derived. So to orient you again, up here is the hypothalamus. And down here is the anterior pituitary, or the adenohypophysis, or the ant pit, as I like to call it for short. And what I want you to notice here is in this drawing, you can see that there is a incoming blood vessel here carrying oxygenated blood, and that it enters into a capillary bed in the hypothalamus. From that capillary bed, we have some venules, or very small veins, that exit out of that capillary bed and travel to the anterior pituitary. Now I need to back up here for a second and remind you of something, and that is the normal architecture of blood vessels in the human body is you have an artery. It leads to, it's a really tiny artery called an arteriole, but you have an artery. It leads to a capillary bed where we deliver oxygen out to tissues and pick up metabolic waste products like carbon dioxide. And then that capillary bed feeds into a very small vein called a venule, and those eventually feed into larger veins and return back to the heart. That's the normal setup. There are a few places in the body, however, where we have something called a portal system. Portal systems are places where I have one bed of capillaries attached to a second bed of capillaries without first going back to the heart. Okay, so normally once I have a capillary bed, I immediately go back to the heart again before I go out to any other part of the body. But in a portal system, that rule is left out. Okay, we don't have that rule. So as you can see, for example, in this instance here that I've drawn, we do indeed have one capillary bed here. We travel through a blood vessel to a second capillary bed. And notice we did not go back to the heart in between going between these two capillary beds. So by definition, this is a portal system. And because this portal system connects the hypothalamus with the adenohypophysis, we give it a special name. We call it the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Now we're going to see when we get to studying things like the digestive system that there's other types of portal systems in the body. For example, the hepatic portal vein is a portal system that connects the small intestines with your liver. Again, this is where you go from one bed of capillaries to a second bed of capillaries without first returning to the heart. Why do we have this portal system present here? Well, this portal system is what permits the hypothalamus to secrete chemical messengers in the form of hormones with the word releasing or inhibiting in their name. Those get secreted into this portal system, into this capillary bed, and then they diffuse downward in the blood to the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary, and once in the anterior pituitary, they diffuse out of the blood, and this signals tissues in the anterior pituitary to respond by releasing other types of hormones. So I'll give you one example. Since we've been focusing on the thyroid gland on the previous slide, let's do that one. If I release thyrotropin releasing hormone, it travels through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, and it reaches the adenohypophysis, which is another name for the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates the release of a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin for short. And there's that, remember I told you before, you'd see the word troph or tropin in a lot of hormones, and there it is. Once I have thyroid stimulating hormone getting released into the blood, which is what happens next, that thyroid stimulating hormone travels eventually to the thyroid gland and causes the release of thyroid hormone. So let me back up here and I'll show you again. Remember our picture here of an axis. we had thyrotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. It traveled through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system and induced the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. So this was a positive relationship. It was an excitatory relationship, if you want to think of it that way. And then thyroid stimulating hormone was released into the blood, eventually circulated until it made contact with its target organ, the thyroid gland, and then there induced the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone throughout the body. So again, another stimulatory relationship. So there's an example of an axis, and we're going to learn even more about these axes in class. So that's kind of an overview of how the hypothalamus interacts with the adenohypophysis. And it has to have this interesting interaction because the hypothalamus, remember, is neuronal tissue, but the anterior pituitary is epithelial tissue. So we had to come up with sort of a unique way of those two communicating with each other because we couldn't use just simple action potentials to do the job. Now, what I think is interesting is that if we go and look at the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis, the hypothalamus can communicate with the neurohypophysis in a different manner. And that's because, remember, the neurohypophysis is made of neuronal tissue. So we have what in essence constitutes a big old mass of axons that stem from the somas or the neuronal cell bodies found in the hypothalamus. Here are their axons, and they extend downward all the way into the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. And they travel through a neck-shaped region that connects the pituitary gland with the hypothalamus. And that neck region or stalk-like region is called the infundibulum. And it's through which both the portal system and these axons travel. Now, these massive axons come from the hypothalamus, and what happens is these cell bodies that are in the hypothalamus up here, and I need to get rid of all of this so we can see a little easier. These cell bodies up here manufacture neurotransmitters. They then shuttle those neurotransmitters down to the axon terminals here and store them in the axon terminals. This is the same thing that we've already seen when we learned about the nervous system and how neurons function. They manufacture neurotransmitters, they shuttle those neurotransmitters down to the axon terminal and store them in vesicles there, awaiting a time when an action potential signals their release. So to get their release, we would have an action potential travel downward, down these axons, and when the action potential reaches the axon terminal, then we have release of the neurotransmitter. And then in this case, the neurotransmitter is released directly into the blood. So because they're released directly in the blood, we consider them hormones. I know that's a little strange because yes, it is true, they're manufactured by neurons, but because they do not communicate across the synaptic cleft with a second neuron, but instead are released directly into the bloodstream, we classify them as hormones. You'll be glad to know there's only two different types of hormones that are manufactured by these neurons in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary. And those are oxytocin, which is important in childbirth and delivery because it stimulates uterine contractions, and another hormone called ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone. And this is a hormone that helps you retain water so you don't lose water in urine and become dehydrated. So the way in which I actually get release of oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone, once again, is via an action potential traveling down this bundle of axons. And we have a special name for that bundle of axons. You'll remember anytime I have a bundle of axons present in the central nervous system, we call that a tract. So by definition, this would be called the hypophyseal or hypophyseal tract. So when we were talking about the anterior pituitary, the communication route between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary was called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. When we talk about communication between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, it's the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. That's a major difference. So that gives you kind of an overview of the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitaries. In class, we're really going to start looking specifically at what hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of which hormone from the anterior pituitary and what kind of an effect that has on the body and the different types of axes that are formed by these interactions.